The sun shone pleasantly over the village green of Muchwood-on-Lee, where bunting fluttered gently in the late spring breeze. A marquee had been erected on the vicarage lawn, its white canvas walls casting elongated shadows over the tables of Victoria sponge, lemon-curd tarts, and dainty crustless sandwiches. The annual fete, hosted by the Muchwood Literary Society, was a modest but beloved tradition, attended by most of the village and tolerated by the rest. Miss Jane Marple settled in a wicker chair near the tea-urn with a cup of Darjeeling, and a modest scone surveyed the proceedings with quiet interest. To the untrained eye, she appeared every inch the doting great-aunt, all white lace gloves and rose-pink cardigan. Yet beneath the lace and softness lay a mind that had, time and again, pierced the darkest recesses of human deceit. Today's fete was in honor of the late Mrs. Isabel Carmody, founder of the Literary Society, who had passed away the previous autumn. Her nephew, Mr. Felix Carmody, had returned from his position at the British Museum to settle her affairs and donate her extensive collection of books to the village library. A generous gesture, though some whispered it had more to do with avoiding probate taxes than sentiment. "Shame about Isabel," murmured Mrs. Lavinia Prowse, the vicar's wife, leaning over Miss Marple's shoulder. Though she could be terribly sharp-tongued, she did keep the book club in order, I suppose. Felix will try to run it now, but I don't think he's quite the same sort. Miss Marple nodded absently, her eyes following Felix, who stood near a display table of old books. A thin, scholarly man in wire-rimmed spectacles, he looked less comfortable at a village gathering than a cat at a dog show. At that moment, Miss Partridge, the spinster librarian and notorious stickler for order, emerged from the tent clutching a worn volume in both hands, as though it were a relic of divine provenance. "This," she announced dramatically, "was returned anonymously this morning, in the library returns box. It is The Orchid House by Phyllis Shand Alfrey, due back 2 years ago." A few polite titters went around the crowd, though most paid little. "Attention," Miss Partridge continued, her voice quivering with unspent outrage. "It was last checked out by Mrs. Carmody, 3 months after she died." The titters stopped. "Well, she always did insist on punctuality," murmured Mr. Penrose, the retired solicitor, but his joke fell flat. The air suddenly felt still. "Perhaps it was misfiled," offered Mrs. Prowse, though her tone lacked conviction. "No, I personally inspected the Carmody house after the books were boxed," Miss Partridge said firmly. "This one was not among them." Felix Carmody stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles with a frown. "That must be a mistake. I cleared the house thoroughly myself." "A prank, surely," said Colonel Danforth, puffing his pipe. "Children? Perhaps, or someone having a bit of fun." But Miss Marple, watching the reactions with a placid smile, noted a flicker in Felix's eyes, a twitch quickly concealed, and an almost imperceptible tightening of Mrs. Partridge's lips. The fete resumed in uneasy silence, but beneath the bunting and buttercream, something had shifted. A book returned from the grave was one thing, but who had returned it, and why now? Miss Marple took another sip of her tea and folded her hands in her lap. She had seen enough of human nature to know that coincidence was rarely just that. Somewhere among these pleasant villagers, a story was beginning, and she, of course, would read it to its final page. A light drizzle had begun by late afternoon, sending villagers scurrying, home from the fete with paper plates tucked under arms and umbrellas popping open like mushrooms. By the time the last crumbs of Victoria sponge were swept away, Muchwood-on-Lee had already begun to hum with speculation. At the corner shop, Mrs. Cleary told anyone who would listen that it had to be one of those spiritualist people Isabel used to mix with, seances, tarot cards, all that nonsense. While Mr. Phipps, the village's enthusiastic postmaster, was overheard saying it had to be a clerical error, though his argument lost weight when he couldn't remember the last time Miss Partridge made a clerical error. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her tidy cottage on Church Lane and settled by the fireplace with her knitting, though her needles clicked more slowly than usual. Her thoughts wandered, not towards spirits or supernatural returnings, but to timelines. Miss Partridge had said the book was due back 2 years ago. Mrs. Carmody had died just over 18 months past, and Felix had returned only recently, which meant— She paused, eyes narrowing. If Mrs. Carmody had checked out the book after her death, it wasn't merely curious. It was impossible. The next morning, the weather had turned clear and crisp, as if the clouds had simply rinsed the village and left it fresher for the effort. Miss Marple made her way to the library, as she often did on Mondays, arriving just after the doors opened. Miss Partridge was at the front desk, surrounded by neat piles of books ready for reshelving. She looked up with her usual brisk nod. "Good. Morning, Miss Marple. You'll find the new mysteries are on the left display. One of them's rather gruesome, I'm afraid." Miss Marple smiled warmly and stepped closer. "Oh, I shall certainly look at those in due course. But I was hoping to ask you something, if you don't mind." Miss Partridge adjusted her glasses, wary but attentive. "That business yesterday," Miss Marple continued, her tone deliberately casual, "about the Orchid House. You said it was returned anonymously, in the after-hours box." Miss Partridge nodded sharply. "Precisely at 8:03 that morning, or shortly thereafter. I unlocked the return box myself before I opened the building. And you're absolutely certain it was last checked out to Mrs. Carmody?" Miss Marple's voice carried only curiosity, no suspicion. "Without question, I've checked the borrower's card, stamped and signed out in her name." Miss Partridge hesitated, then added, "And what's more, it wasn't even due 2 years ago. It was checked out 2 years ago. The due date was 3 weeks after that." Miss Marple gave a gentle "oh," her brow knitting as if she were puzzled. "So curious," she murmured. "And such a distinctive book, too. I seem to recall it was kept on the upper fiction shelf. Left-hand side, wasn't it? Rather high up." Miss Partridge looked almost pleased. "That's correct. Caribbean authors, 3rd shelf from the top." "I wonder," Miss Marple mused, "if perhaps someone found it among old belongings and felt guilty for the delay. Mightn't they have returned it quietly, not wanting to stir embarrassment?" Miss Partridge sniffed. "Then why not leave a note? No one minds a late return. It's the irregularity that's offensive." Of course, Miss Marple agreed amiably. "Thank you, my dear. You've such an eye for detail. It's very reassuring." She took a slim novel from the new arrivals display and left shortly after, but her mind was not on crime fiction. She spent the remainder of the morning walking the village, not aimlessly, but with soft purpose. By mid-afternoon she had gathered more pieces of the puzzle, small ones, but sharp-edged enough to cut if placed correctly. First was Kitty Benham, the young woman who assisted Felix in cataloguing Mrs. Carmody's library before the donation. Miss Marple encountered her outside the greengrocer's, where she was balancing a basket of apples against her hip. "Oh yes, I helped Mr. Carmody for a few afternoons last month," Kitty said brightly. "There were so many books, hundreds." "Really? Some in boxes already, others still shelved in her study." "I didn't do much, just sorted and dusted. The ones that smelled of mildew he told me to discard." "Such a shame," Miss Marple replied. "I remember Mrs. Carmody being very particular about her books. I imagine she kept them in immaculate order." Kitty's face clouded slightly. "Actually, no. Some were in odd places. Behind cupboard doors, under the stairwell. One book I found in a sewing basket, of all things, but Mr. Carmody said his aunt had become forgetful in her final year." That was not Miss Marple's impression of the late Isabel Carmody, but she said nothing. She simply asked Kitty if she had ever seen the Orchid House during her help sessions. Kitty frowned and shook her head. "No. But I didn't go through every single book." Mr. Carmody boxed up a few sections on his own. By evening, Miss Marple had pieced together the schedule. Mrs. Carmody's books were boxed in April, transported to the library in early May. Felix had been in the village for only 6 weeks, but in that short time he had spent several afternoons alone in his aunt's former home. The house, still unsold, remained largely undisturbed, just as Isabel had left it. That night, Miss Marple attended her usual Tuesday bridge circle at the Vicarage, where a few friends had gathered for cards and cake. Conversation inevitably circled back to the fete, and then to the mystery of the returned book. "I still say it's all a fuss over nothing," huffed Colonel Danforth, laying down a rather hopeless hand of clubs. "A misplaced novel is hardly the stuff of Agatha Christie." Miss Marple smiled politely, though she disagreed. She had found that small things often meant far more than they seemed. A teacup turned the wrong way, a dropped stitch in a scarf. A book returned when its reader had been dead for over a year. As the others debated the likelihood of pranksters or spectral borrowers, Miss Marple's gaze flickered briefly to Felix Carmody, who had joined the circle that evening and was now laughing somewhat too loudly at one of Reverend Prowse's weak jokes. He was wearing the same dark brown suit he had worn at the fete, though tonight it seemed somehow less crisp. There were faint smudges on the cuffs, as if recently brushed, but not laundered, and when he excused himself to fetch more tea, Miss Marple saw it, a paper cut on the edge of his thumb. Small, recent, the sort of cut one might receive slipping a book into a narrow return slot. That night, as she laid aside her knitting and prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected once again on the curious sequence of events. A book could not return itself. Someone had placed it there deliberately and had done so hoping it would not be recognized. But of course it had been, which meant the person had not understood the way village memory worked. In London, perhaps, such an act might have passed unnoticed. But in Muchwood-on-Lee, where the librarian remembered every borrower and the vicar's wife recalled who had which china pattern at their wedding, the dead did not return books without someone noticing, and now someone was noticing. Miss Marple reached for her diary and, in her precise old-fashioned script, made a short note. Felix, cut on thumb, suit dusty, book found early. Why returned now? Then she circled one name lightly and closed the diary. Tomorrow she would pay a visit to Mrs. Carmody's house. After all, the boxes may have been removed, but sometimes the most revealing things were those that had been left behind. The morning after the bridge circle dawned cool and clear, a sharp breeze rustling the fresh green leaves of the elm trees, lining Muchwood's High Street. Miss Marple, wrapped in her well-worn tweed coat and carrying her usual wicker basket, made her way toward Isabel Carmody's old house, a modest Georgian residence set back behind a low stone wall and an overgrown rose garden. The house had been silent since Felix had returned, and despite its neat appearance, there was something about the place that struck Miss Marple as unusually heavy, like a room filled with too many memories and not enough air. Felix himself was already there when she arrived, unlocking the front door with a ring of keys. His expression was guarded but polite as he opened the door wider and stepped aside. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. "I wasn't expecting you so early." "I thought it best to come before the village gets busy," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Felix answered, closing the door behind her. "Feel free to look around. I'm only going through some old documents in the study." Miss Marple nodded and moved into the main sitting room, where bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, some with empty spaces where volumes had once stood. A large writing desk was cluttered with papers, an inkpot, and a scattering of pens. The furniture was old, but well cared for. She ran her fingers lightly over the spines of the remaining books, recalling Kitty's mention of how some had been tucked away in unusual places. Miss Marple's eyes caught on a faint indentation on one shelf, where a book had clearly been removed hastily, leaving a slight shadow on the dust. Nearby, a small sewing basket sat on a low table, just as Kitty had described. The lid was slightly ajar. Miss Marple carefully lifted it, revealing a handful of sewing tools and, surprisingly, a slender volume wrapped in faded brown paper. Unwrapping it, she found another book, a guide to herb gardening. It was not particularly rare, but its presence, here, among sewing notions, suggested it had been deliberately hidden or forgotten. Before she could examine it further, Felix's voice called from the study. "Jane, are you looking at anything interesting?" She called back softly. "Just a small discovery. Might you join me a moment?" Felix appeared, drying his hands on a handkerchief, his gaze sharpening at the book in her hands. "That belonged to my aunt," he said quietly. "She was fond of herbal remedies." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It seems she kept more than just novels in her collection. I wonder, did she ever mention any troubles or worries to you?" Felix hesitated. "No, she was private. We didn't talk much about her later years. That was consistent with what Miss Marple had heard so far. Isabel Carmody was a woman who kept her cards close. Curious about the study itself, Miss Marple walked over to the desk. Papers were stacked in neat piles, but one document lay open, an old letter, yellowed and carefully folded. She picked it up, reading quietly. It was a letter from a solicitor dated nearly a decade ago, referencing a disputed will. "Felix, may I ask, was there ever any trouble over your aunt's inheritance?" Miss Marple inquired. Felix's face tightened. "No, nothing beyond the usual. She left everything to me, as the only relative." Miss Marple studied him a moment, then said, "These sorts of letters often hide more than they reveal." He nodded, though without elaboration. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Felix excused himself to answer, returning with Mrs. Lavinia Prowse, the vicar's wife, looking somewhat flustered but determined. "Mr. Carmody," she said briskly, "I hope I'm not intruding, but I thought it necessary to speak with you about recent events in the village." Felix gave a small, polite bow. "Of course, Mrs. Prowse. Please come in." Miss Marple watched as Lavinia's eyes swept the room, briefly resting on the book Miss Marple still held. There was something keen and probing in her gaze, as if she weighed the value of every object and every person. Lavinia's tone grew serious. "There's been much gossip, naturally, about the book returned after your aunt's passing. I've heard whispers that it might be a sign of unfinished business." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose imperceptibly but said nothing. Felix sighed. "I appreciate your concern, but I assure you, I intend to settle my aunt's affairs properly. The book's return is a mystery to me as well." Lavinia glanced at Miss Marple, a flicker of recognition passing between them. "I think we all sense there is more beneath the surface here," she said quietly. After she left, Felix looked wearier. "You see, Miss Marple, my aunt's life was not as straightforward as it appeared. I've discovered old correspondences, some troubling. She was involved in village disputes, some bitter. I hadn't realized until I sorted through her papers. Miss—" Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Such is often the case. Small villages tend to hold grudges like well-kept secrets." Felix gestured toward the open letter again. "That will dispute was the least of it. I found letters hinting at arguments over property lines, family quarrels, even a strange mention of a lost legacy." Intrigued, Miss Marple decided to inquire further. "Did your aunt have close friends or confidants who might know more?" "Not really," Felix replied. "She was somewhat solitary, except for the book club and a few acquaintances." "That brings to mind the recent fete," Miss Marple observed. "The villagers seemed quite vocal about her." Felix smiled faintly. Yes, many remembered her sharp tongue. Later that day, Miss Marple visited the village pub, the Crown, and Thistle, where the heart of Muchwood's social life beat steadily. It was a cosy place, with dark wooden beams and a warm fire, where gossip flowed as freely as the ale. She found Kitty Benham chatting with the landlord behind the bar and joined them with a gentle smile. "I hear you've been helping Felix with the books," Miss Marple began. Kitty nodded eagerly. "Yes, though I can't help but wonder if we missed something important. There were books my aunt seemed to hide away, maybe to keep them from prying eyes." Miss Marple's interest deepened. "Did any of the villagers have reasons to resent Mrs. Carmody?" Kitty thought for a moment. "Well, there was the matter of the land next to the vicarage. A long-standing dispute. Mrs. Carmody was quite firm about keeping her boundaries." "That's intriguing," Miss Marple said softly. "And what of Felix? Has he mentioned anything about these disputes?" Kitty shook her head. "No, but I have noticed he's been rather tense lately. People say he's been seen in heated conversations with Mr. Penrose, the retired solicitor." Miss Marple made a mental note. The retired solicitor had appeared at the fete, making a light joke about the ghostly return of the book. Perhaps his role in village affairs was more complex. As the evening drew on, Miss Marple left the pub with her mind alive with threads to follow, old letters, hushed arguments, and a returned book that seemed less a mistake and more a message. Back. In her cottage, she carefully spread out the letters Felix had mentioned, reading the yellowed pages by lamplight. There was mention of a contested inheritance, veiled threats, and a reference to a missing will, last seen in the possession of a trusted friend. The more she read, the clearer it became. The returned book was no mere coincidence. It was a thread pulled loose from a tightly woven fabric, one that concealed much more than a late library return. Miss Marple reached for her diary and wrote a few notes, her handwriting precise. Inheritance dispute. Missing will, trusted friend unknown, possible resentment over land, Felix and Penrose confrontation. Books return a signal? She closed the diary and stared into the flickering fire. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but not yet, into a clear picture. Somewhere in Muchwood-on-Lee, a secret was waiting to be uncovered, one that might explain why a book had been returned from the grave, and what danger that revelation might bring. As sleep claimed her, Miss Marple knew tomorrow would bring fresh discoveries, for in the quietest villages, the deepest secrets always waited patiently to be found. The following morning dawned grey and misty, the kind of damp chill that settled deep into the bones and seemed to coax the village into a slower rhythm. Miss Marple set out early, her mind occupied with the tangled threads she had begun to unravel. There was a quiet determination behind her calm demeanour, the patient resolve of one who knew that in matters of human nature, the smallest detail often held the key to the greatest truths. Her first visit was to Mr. Penrose's residence, a quaint, red-brick cottage near the village edge, bordered by a neat garden that looked as meticulously kept as its owner. The retired solicitor was an upright man, known for his sharp intellect and a certain sternness that commanded respect in village affairs. Miss Marple was greeted with a polite but measured smile when she knocked on the door. Penrose himself opened, his expression a mixture of curiosity and cautious hospitality. "Good morning, Mr. Penrose," Miss Marple began. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all, Miss Marple," he replied, stepping aside to let her in. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I was hoping to discuss the late Mrs. Carmody," she said, settling into a chair in the modest sitting room. "You and Mr. Carmody have recently had some conversations, I understand?" Penrose's eyes flickered briefly, betraying a trace of unease. "Yes, Felix and I spoke a few times. It's only natural, given the circumstances surrounding his aunt's estate." Miss Marple nodded. I understand there was some dispute over a will. Perhaps you might clarify for me what you know." Penrose cleared his throat, his fingers tightening around a teacup. "The situation is somewhat complicated. Mrs. Carmody's last years were clouded by ill health and, regrettably, some estrangement from certain members of the family. There was an earlier will, now missing, that would have affected the distribution of her assets." "Missing?" Miss Marple echoed softly. "Yes. The will's whereabouts remain unknown. Some suspected it might have been destroyed or concealed. And this trusted friend mentioned in the letters, do you have any idea who that might be?" Penrose's gaze hardened. "I cannot say for certain, but there were whispers that Mrs. Carmody confided in a local solicitor prior to her death." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Would that solicitor happen to be yourself?" Penrose stiffened. "I was indeed involved, but I can assure you I have acted with integrity. The missing will is a mystery I hope will be resolved." "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly. "I appreciate your candor." As their conversation wound down, Miss Marple carefully noted his guarded manner. There was truth in his words, but a hesitation that suggested more beneath the surface. Leaving Penrose's cottage, she paused outside, glancing down the lane toward the village centre. The dampness had lifted, and a few villagers were beginning their daily routines. Shopkeepers sweeping storefronts, children heading to school, and the occasional farmer tending to livestock. Her next call was on Mrs. Lavinia Prowse, whose earlier visit had hinted at her own stake in the village's hidden tensions. The vicar's wife welcomed her into the cosy parlour, where lace curtains softened the morning light. "Jane," Lavinia began without preamble, "I've been thinking about the returned book. It's more than a mere curiosity. I suspect it's a deliberate message." Miss Marple smiled. "You have the instincts of a true observer, Lavinia." Lavinia nodded, pouring tea into delicate cups. "I believe someone in the village wanted to remind us all that the past is never truly buried." Miss Marple accepted the tea, savouring the warmth. "Did your husband mention anything unusual? The vicar's role often brings him into contact with secrets." "Yes, indeed. Reverend Prowse mentioned hearing raised voices at the Carmody house a few days ago, though he didn't say between whom." "Felix, perhaps," Miss Marple ventured. "Possibly, or someone else. I shall ask him later." They spoke quietly of village life and the subtle undercurrents that could turn neighbour against neighbour. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on how the return of a single book had stirred such a potent mix of fear, suspicion, and unresolved grievances. Later that afternoon, she visited the much-talked-about rose garden behind the Carmody house. The path was narrow and overgrown, with the scent of damp earth mingling with the faint perfume of lingering blooms. As she wandered among the faded petals, her eyes caught a scrap of paper wedged beneath a stone near the garden bench. Picking it up, she unfolded the small, crumpled note. The handwriting was hurried but legible. "The past will not lie silent. Seek where shadows fall." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. This was no accident. Someone wanted the truth to emerge but was too cautious or too fearful to say it outright. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Turning, she saw Kitty Benham approaching, a concerned expression on her face. "I'm sorry to bother you again, Miss Marple," Kitty said breathlessly, "but I thought you should know. Felix was seen arguing with Mr. Phipps, the postmaster, just this morning near the library." "Really?" Miss Marple asked. "Did you hear what the dispute was about?" Kitty shook her head. "No, but Mr. Phipps looked very upset afterward and Felix seemed tense. I thought it might be connected to the book or the estate." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Kitty. That is useful to know." As Kitty hurried off, Miss Marple reflected on the growing web of conflicts. The village's gentle facade was peeling away, revealing layers of resentment and fear, She made her way to the library, where the crisp air inside contrasted with the damp chill outside. Miss Partridge was at her desk, looking harried but welcoming. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said. "I heard about Felix and Mr. Phipps. Quite the stir." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Can you tell me anything more?" Miss Partridge hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Mr. Phipps is a proud man. He resents anyone who threatens the order of things here. Felix's return upset some people, I think." Miss Marple observed the librarian carefully. "And do you think the book's return might be part of that?" Miss Partridge sighed. "Perhaps. It's as if someone wants to unsettle the village, though I cannot say why." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the return box, now empty and innocuous, but she remembered the small paper cut on Felix's thumb, the smudges on his suit, the urgency behind his movements. The mystery was deepening, and so was the danger, as twilight fell over Muchwood-on-Lee. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where she poured herself a cup of tea and reviewed the day's events. The missing will, the disputes over land, the cryptic note in the garden, Felix's confrontations, all were pieces of a puzzle whose edges were becoming clearer. Her thoughts returned to the returned book, the orchid house, whose very presence was a challenge to silence and secrecy. Tomorrow, she decided, would bring new questions, and perhaps the first true answers. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, aware that in a village where everyone knew each other's histories, the dead often spoke loudest of all. The village awoke under a pale, silvery dawn, the mist clinging low over the fields and winding its way through the narrow streets of Muchwood-on-Lee like a whispered secret. Miss Marple stood at her kitchen window, staring out at the slow unfurling of the day. The events of the past days had settled heavily upon the village, threading unease through the daily routines of even the most ordinary folk. With a well-turned handkerchief tied around her neck, she wrapped her coat more snugly and stepped out, determined to pursue the delicate thread that had begun to unravel the quiet tapestry of Muchwood life. Her first call was to the post office, a modest red-brick building with a faded sign, where Mr. Phipps conducted his business with the formality of a man guarding more than just mail. The bell above the door jingled faintly as she entered, and Phipps looked up from his ledger with a brief flicker of surprise. "Good morning, Mr. Phipps," Miss Marple greeted him softly, her tone friendly yet purposeful. "I hear you had a rather heated exchange with Mr. Carmody earlier this week." Phipps's thin lips pressed into a firm line. "Yes, I suppose you could call it that," he said, voice low. "Felix was asking questions about some old letters and documents I've kept. I wasn't about to have him poking into matters best left alone." Miss Marple arched an eyebrow. What sort of matters might those be? He hesitated, then glanced around the quiet shop. Some years ago, there was a disagreement involving the Carmody family and the Vicarage over a parcel of land. Felix seems determined to reopen old wounds. I advised him to tread carefully. "Do you think there is more to this than just land disputes?" she pressed gently. Phipps's gaze darkened. "It's not just the land. There have always been old resentments, secrets best kept in the shadows. Felix's questions threaten to bring them into the light." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Phipps. It seems your role in the village is more complicated than it appears." As she left the post office, the crisp morning air filled her lungs, clearing the fog not only outside but, she hoped, within the tangled mystery itself. Each person she encountered seemed to carry a piece of the puzzle, but none yet revealed the full picture. Next, she visited the vicarage. Reverend and Mrs. Prowse received her warmly, the vicar's study lined with books and worn leather chairs, offering a sense of steadiness amid the storm gathering over the village. Reverend Prowse spoke of his late friend Isabel Carmody with genuine affection, though his brow furrowed when mentioning the recent disturbances. She was a woman of sharp mind and strong will, he reflected. Her passing left more questions than answers, it seems. "Do you know anything about this missing will?" Miss Marple asked, watching the vicar closely. "I only know what Felix has told me, that it was meant to clarify her final wishes but has vanished." There was talk of someone close to Isabel who might have had reason to conceal it. The mention stirred a memory for Miss Marple. Was there anyone in particular? The Reverend shook his head. "I cannot say. Villagers are careful with their tongues these days." Mrs. Prowse exchanged a glance with her husband before speaking. "Jane was right to say the returned book is a message. There is fear here, a fear that the past might expose more than just family disagreements." Miss Marple's gaze rested on the bookcases lining the room. Secrets have a way of surfacing when least expected. She left the vicarage with a sense of the village's pulse quickening. Beneath the surface politeness lay anxiety and simmering tensions. Later that day, Miss Marple arranged to meet Felix at the Cardy house, wishing to discuss what she had learned. Felix greeted her with a weary smile, shadows under his eyes betraying restless nights. "I have spoken to Mr. Penrose, Mr. Phipps, and the Prowses," she began gently. "It seems your aunt's affairs are tangled not only by legal complications, but by old grievances woven through the village." Felix sighed. "I had hoped to settle everything quietly, but it appears the past refuses to stay buried." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then asked, "Felix, have you noticed anything unusual about the book itself, apart from its mysterious return?" He nodded. "Yes. When I first found it, there was a loose piece of paper tucked inside. A note, but written in a code I couldn't decipher." "May I see it?" Miss Marple requested. He retrieved the paper from his jacket pocket, handing it over carefully. The note contained a series of letters and numbers, seemingly random at first glance. Miss Marple examined it closely. "This looks like a cipher," she said. "A common method used to conceal messages. Do you know anyone who might have left it?" Felix shook his head. "No, it must have been my aunt, but why hide a message in a book?" "Perhaps she wanted someone to find the truth. But only if they were clever enough to read it," Miss Marple mused. Determined to unravel the cipher, Miss Marple returned home and set about decoding the note with her accustomed patience. The puzzle revealed a brief but chilling message. "Beware the past that will not rest." The note's ominous tone deepened the mystery, suggesting that Isabel Carmody's life had been shadowed by dangers far greater than mere family quarrels. The following day, Miss Marple attended the local market, blending easily into the bustling crowd while quietly listening to the undercurrents of conversation. Whispers about the returned book had spread like wildfire, and speculation ran rife. She caught snippets of talk. "It's a curse, I tell you," muttered a farmer to his companion. "Old grudges never die in a place like this." "Another," voice added. "Felix must be hiding something. No one stirs up the past without a reason." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the faces around her, noting the tension and fear mingled with curiosity. Among the villagers, many wore masks of civility, but beneath those masks were hidden stories and motives. Her attention was drawn to a small group gathered near the flower stall, where Kitty Benham was speaking in low tones with a few familiar faces. Approaching discreetly, Miss Marple caught a fragment of their conversation about a late-night visitor seen near the Carmody house. You say someone was there after dark?" she asked Kitty later, who looked startled but nodded. "Yes, Miss Marple. I heard that a man was seen lurking near the garden. No one knows who he was, but it wasn't Felix." This revelation added a new layer of intrigue. Who would risk wandering the village at night near the Carmody house, and why? That evening, Miss Marple reflected on the day's discoveries. The cipher, the missing will, the secret visitor, all pointed toward a web of deception that stretched deeper than she had imagined. The returned book, once thought a mere curiosity, now stood as a beacon calling forth hidden truths. Somewhere, in Muchwood-on-Lea, The past was reaching out, demanding to be heard, and warning of shadows yet to come. With a steady breath, Miss Marple prepared herself for what lay ahead, knowing that in the quiet corners of the village, the faintest whisper could lead to the most startling revelations. The morning mist still lingered lightly over Muchwood-on-Lea as Miss Marple set out with a quiet sense of purpose. The previous day's discoveries had stirred something beneath the surface, a subtle shift in the village's rhythm that hinted at secrets more perilous than mere family disputes. The ciphered note and reports of a nocturnal visitor had opened a door, and now it was up to her to step through and glimpse what lay beyond. Her first visit was to the village inn, the Plough and Harrow, where Felix Carmody had taken up temporary residence since returning. The common room was just beginning to fill with locals seeking their morning tea and gossip. Felix sat by the window, papers spread before him, his face drawn and serious. Miss Marple approached quietly, and he looked up with a weary smile. "Good. Morning, Miss Marple. I was hoping to find you," he said. "There's something I must tell you, something I discovered last night." She settled into the chair opposite him, keen to hear. "Please, Felix, go on." He unfolded a sheet of paper. "This is a letter I found tucked inside an old book of my aunt's, one that wasn't catalogued properly in the library." He hesitated. "It's addressed to her but never sent. It speaks of fear of betrayal by someone close, someone she trusted." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the neat handwriting. The letter was guarded but unmistakably anxious, hinting at a secret that might threaten Isabel Carmody's peace of mind. "Did your aunt name this person?" Miss Marple asked softly. "No. She only refers to the shadow that walks beside me, and warns to trust no one with the estate's secrets." The cryptic phrase sent a chill through Miss Marple, who recognized the metaphor for betrayal all too well. It confirmed what she had begun to suspect. The Carmody family's troubles were tangled with far more than legalities and land disputes. After leaving Felix to contemplate his discoveries, Miss Marple made her way toward the village library. Miss Partridge greeted her with a cautious smile, but the librarian's eyes were clouded with worry. "I understand you've been speaking with Felix," Miss Partridge began. "There's more unrest than usual. Some villagers think the past should stay buried. Yet the returned book insists otherwise," Miss Marple said quietly. "Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Visitors, changes in the library?" Miss Partridge glanced toward the back rooms. "There's been an increase in people requesting old volumes related to the Carmody family. Some come out of curiosity, others with less clear motives." Miss Marple's gaze fell on the return box, which had long since emptied. "And the book, The Orchid House, is it truly unique here?" "Yes. Only one copy, last checked out decades ago," the librarian confirmed. "Its sudden return has unsettled many." As Miss Marple stepped outside, she noticed Mr. Phipps across the street, watching the library with narrowed eyes. His presence was no accident. It seemed the postmaster's watchfulness extended beyond his own shop. Later that afternoon, a chance encounter offered new insight. Miss Marple met Mrs. Lavinia Prowse by the village green, tending to her roses with the delicate care that seemed to mirror her sharp attention to detail. "I've been thinking about your cipher, Jane," Lavinia said, using her familiar name. "I believe it may relate to a local landmark, where shadows truly fall." Miss Marple considered this, the note's message echoing in her mind. Seek where shadows fall. Could it be a reference to the old chapel ruin on the village outskirts? The place was steeped in history and whispered secrets. Together, they decided to visit the ruins before dusk, hoping to uncover any forgotten clue. As they approached, the chapel's crumbling stone walls cast long shadows across the overgrown graveyard. The air was heavy with the scent of moss and damp earth, and the silence felt profound, almost sacred. Miss Marple's eyes caught the glint of something metallic half buried beneath a fallen column. Carefully, she brushed away the soil to reveal a small, tarnished locket. Inside was a faded miniature portrait, an unknown woman with eyes strikingly familiar. "This must have been hidden for some time," Miss Marple murmured. "But why? Here." Lavinia fingered the locket thoughtfully. Perhaps it belonged to someone who wanted to disappear, or to someone others wished forgotten. The discovery added weight to the mystery, hinting at a history of concealed relationships and unspoken alliances. Returning to the village as twilight deepened, Miss Marple found Felix waiting anxiously outside the inn. He approached with a cautious hopefulness. "There's been a development," he said. "Mr. Penrose came to see me today. He claims he found a document among my aunt's papers, an unsigned will." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Unsigned, you say?" "Yes. He says it complicates everything. The document leaves the estate to a charity, but without a signature, its validity is uncertain." "That would explain much," Miss Marple said. "Felix, we must examine this document closely." They arranged to meet the following morning at Penrose's office. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, reflecting on the strands of the case: the missing will, the returned book, the ciphered note, the secret visitor. All these were pieces of a greater puzzle. The village's placid surface masked deeper currents of fear and betrayal. Miss Marple's mind wandered to the faces she had seen: the wary postmaster, the guarded solicitor, the anxious Felix, and she sensed a delicate game unfolding. Each played a part, and in their actions were clues, subtle and telling. Tomorrow would bring more questions, perhaps answers, but Miss Marple knew that patience was her greatest ally. For now, the shadows lengthened over Muchwood-on-Lee, and the past whispered ever more insistently, beckoning her to uncover its truths before the next move could be made. The morning mist had barely lifted when Miss Marple arrived at Mr. Penrose's office, a modest room above the village solicitor's shop, lined with shelves of legal tomes and faded documents. Felix Carmody was already there, pacing nervously near the window. The weight of uncertainty clung to the air as the three of them gathered around the polished oak desk where Penrose unfolded the contested will. The paper was yellowed with age, its edges frayed, but the text was remarkably clear. It named a charitable trust as the sole beneficiary of Isabel Carmody's estate, a surprising choice given the family's long-standing ties to the village. What troubled Felix most was the absence of a signature, the final flourish that would have rendered the document legally binding. "This must have been a draft," Penrose said quietly, glancing at Felix. "Or perhaps a statement of intent that was never finalized." Felix's jaw tightened. "If this document holds any weight, it could undo everything I had hoped to reclaim." Miss Marple's keen eyes moved beyond the words to the physical details, the faint impressions beneath the ink, the way the paper creased near the margins. "Mr. Penrose," she said gently, "do you notice anything unusual about the handwriting or the paper itself?" Penrose peered closer, his brows knitting. "Now that you mention it, the writing appears steadier than one would expect for a document written under duress or emotional stress. And the paper, it is heavier than the usual stationery we use." "Miss," Marple nodded slowly. Might Isabel have planned this carefully, leaving clues for someone she trusted? Felix looked at her, hope flickering briefly in his eyes. But who would that be? Who would want to see the estate passed to charity rather than family? "The answer may lie in those who stand to lose," Miss Marple said softly, "and those who might gain from keeping this will unsigned and hidden." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp rap on the door. Mr. Phipps entered, his face pale but determined. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, "but I thought you ought to know that a parcel arrived this morning at the post office, addressed to Felix, with no return. Felix took the package carefully, unwrapping the brown paper to reveal an old photograph. The image was faded but unmistakable. Isabel Carmody standing beside a man neither Felix nor Miss Marple recognized. His expression was guarded, almost menacing. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the man's eyes. "Do you know who this might be?" Felix shook his head, a shadow passing over his features. "No. But whoever he is, he must have meant something. To my aunt, or something to her secret," Miss Marple murmured. "Thank you, Mr. Phipps." As the postmaster left, the three turned their attention back to the photograph, which seemed to deepen the mystery rather than clarify it. Later that day, Miss Marple sought out Kitty Benham, who had been a friend to Isabel in her final years. Kitty's small cottage was neat and fragrant with lavender, but her hands trembled slightly when she opened the door. "Jane," she said, ushering Miss Marple inside, "there's more to Isabel's story than anyone realizes." She was afraid, not just of losing her estate, but of someone who followed her even in Muchwood. Miss Marple settled into an armchair. "What do you mean, Kitty?" Kitty took a deep breath. Years ago, before Isabel returned from London, she had a falling out with a man who was dangerous. She never named him, but she spoke of his visits, his threats hidden behind smiles. "Did she keep any record of these visits?" Miss Marple asked gently. Kitty nodded. "She wrote letters, but destroyed most. I found a few she hid in a drawer, mentioning a shadowed figure who haunted her dreams." Miss Marple's mind raced back to the photograph. The unknown man, the ciphered note warning to beware the past, were they connected? The shadows lurking in the village stretched far beyond petty disputes. That evening, as twilight bled into night, Miss Marple wandered the village streets, her thoughts threading through every conversation and observation. She stopped by the old chapel ruins once more, feeling the weight of history pressing down. The locket found there now seemed less a forgotten trinket and more a deliberate signpost. At the village pub, whispers of the shadowed figure had begun to spread, carried on uneasy tongues. Some spoke of a stranger seen near the Carmody estate days before the book's return. Others hinted at a forgotten scandal involving a lost child and a broken engagement. Miss Marple listened quietly, her understanding deepening with every piece of gossip. Each villager's version of the truth was shaded by their own fears and hopes, but beneath it all ran a current of real danger. The next morning brought a letter slipped under her door. Its handwriting was unfamiliar, and the words, "Kurt, stop your meddling, or the past will claim another victim." Miss Marple read it twice, a faint smile playing on her lips. Threats only sharpened her resolve. She returned to the Carmody house where Felix awaited her. "I have something that might interest you," she said, handing over the photograph and letter. "I believe we are dealing with more than inheritance disputes. Your aunt's secrets have roots that twist through many lives." Felix's expression hardened with determination. "Then we must uncover every one of them." Together they planned their next steps. Interviews with villagers who might shed light on the shadowed man, careful re-examination of the library's archives, and discreet inquiries at the post office. Every lead could be a thread to pull, unraveling the tangled web. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, Felix asked quietly, "Do you think we'll find the truth before it's too late?" She met his gaze steadily. "In Muchwood-on-Lee, secrets rarely stay buried. It's a matter of who is brave enough to listen and patient enough to see." With that, Miss Marple stepped into the fading light, the shadows of the village lengthening around her. The game was far from over, but the pieces were moving, and the final picture was beginning to take shape, one that only her gentle yet relentless mind could hope to decipher before the next strike of darkness. That evening, as the village settled into the gentle quiet of dusk, Miss Marple found herself wandering the familiar lanes of Muchwood-on-Lee, her mind threading through the tangled strands of the mystery. The photograph of the unknown man, the unsigned will, the returned library book, all were fragments of a puzzle that, piece by piece, was beginning to reveal the darker currents beneath the village's placid surface. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the locket found at the chapel ruins. The miniature portrait of the woman, her eyes strikingly familiar, had lodged itself in Jane's memory. There was something about that delicate face, something that stirred a distant recollection. Had the woman been someone from Isabel's past, hidden away and deliberately erased from family memory? Or was she connected to the mysterious, shadowed figure Kitty Benham had mentioned? The answer, Miss Marple sensed, lay in the villagers themselves. She decided to begin with those who had known Isabel intimately, the friends and acquaintances who might shed light on the relationships that had frayed behind closed doors. The first on her list was Madge Pierce, the village schoolteacher, whose sharp eyes and discreet manner often caught the undercurrents of gossip and truth alike. Madge's cottage was nestled on the edge of the village green, a tidy place filled with books and pressed flowers. She welcomed Miss Marple warmly but with a reserved air, as if cautious about revealing too much. "I gather you're looking for more about Isabel Carmody," Madge said after a few moments, offering tea. She was a woman of many contradictions, you know, proud yet deeply lonely. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And did she speak of anyone troubling her in her last years? Madge's expression clouded. Yes. There was a man, Charles Bicknell, a distant relation who returned to Muchwood unexpectedly a few years back. He was charming, but with a reputation for being mercurial and dangerous. Did he have any claims to the estate? Miss Marple asked. None legal, Madge replied, but he was known to have been very close to Isabel once. When he left London, many thought their falling out was more than just a family quarrel. Miss Marple filed this away, Charles Bicknell, a name that fit uneasily into the pieces already uncovered. Leaving Madge's home, Jane paused by the village shop where Mr. Phipps was closing up. The postmaster's watchful eyes met hers, and for a moment a flicker of recognition passed between them. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "you may want to speak to Mr. Bicknell yourself. He's taken rooms at the Red Lion. Keeps to himself mostly, but there's an air about him, like a man carrying secrets too heavy to share." That evening, Miss Marple made her way to the Red Lion, a weathered coaching inn that had seen better days but remained a hub for those passing through. In the dimly lit lounge, she found Charles Bicknell seated alone, a glass of brandy resting untouched on the table. He was a striking man with dark hair beginning to silver at the temples and eyes sharp enough to see through pretense. When Miss Marple introduced herself, he smiled politely but with a guarded edge. "I understand you have questions about my relationship with Isabel Carmody," he said smoothly. "Yes," Jane replied, "and about recent events troubling Muchwood. I believe your story is important." Charles sighed, setting down his glass. "Isabel was a complicated woman. We loved and lost, but I would never harm her. Yet your return to the village coincides with unsettling events. The unsigned will, the threats, the cryptic notes," Miss Marple said gently. "You must understand why suspicion falls upon you." He met her gaze steadily. "I returned to make peace, not war. The estate belongs to the family, or so I thought." Miss Marple observed a flicker of something unspoken, a hesitation, a concealed truth. "May I ask, did Isabel confide in you about fears or threats?" Charles's eyes darkened. "Only that she feared the past catching up. She never named who. But I have my own reasons to fear. I came back to find answers, not questions." Miss Marple left the Red Lion with more to ponder. Charles Bicknell was no innocent bystander, but neither was he a simple villain. his presence complicated. The narrative adding layers of past grievances and unresolved passions. Back in her quiet sitting room, Jane reviewed her notes and the letters Felix Carmody had shared. The ciphered notes' reference to shadows and betrayal now took on new meaning against the backdrop of old loves and grudges. Meanwhile, in the village, the atmosphere grew taut with anticipation. Whispers of the shadowed figure and the returned book fueled speculation, while the police, eager to close the case, focused their attention on the more obvious suspects, Felix and Penrose included. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. The evidence, she felt, was like the library's hidden volumes, layered, obscured, and only accessible to those who knew how to read between the lines. The following day, she arranged to meet Felix Carmody again, this time at the village library. Miss Partridge greeted them with a nervous smile, her hands clutching an old ledger she had discovered tucked behind a false panel in the librarian's office. "This ledger," she said, "records borrowing history, but also notes, seemingly unrelated, to specific dates and names." Miss Marple took the ledger, flipping through its delicate pages. The annotations were cryptic, initials, dates, and a few mentions of places that matched locations from the ciphered note and the chapel. "Ruins. It's almost like a diary hidden in plain sight," Jane murmured. Felix leaned closer. "Could these notes point to someone trying to send a message or cover a trail?" "It's possible," Miss Marple agreed, "especially when secrets must remain hidden under the watchful eyes of a village." As they examined the ledger, a soft knock came at the door. Miss Partridge glanced over her shoulder, startled. "It's Mr. Penrose," she whispered. "He says it's urgent." Penrose entered, his face pale and drawn. "I've just received word from the police. There's been an incident at the Carmody estate." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "An incident? What sort?" "A break-in," Penrose replied grimly. "Someone tampered with Isabel's safe. Fortunately, nothing was taken, but the message is clear. They're searching for something." Felix clenched his fists. "Then someone is desperate." Miss Marple's mind raced. The returned library book, the unsigned will, the mysterious photograph, all were clues leading toward a hidden truth someone was willing to risk everything to protect. The evening shadows crept in as they left the library together, the village around them whispering secrets only the most observant could. Here, Miss Marple knew that every step brought them closer to unveiling the tangled web of loyalty and deceit, where trust was fragile and betrayal hid in the gentlest of smiles. And as the night deepened over Muchwood-on-Lee, the true nature of the shadowed figure remained just beyond reach, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself in full. The following morning, Muchwood-on-Lee awoke beneath a heavy, leaden sky, the promise of rain hanging in the air like a shroud. Miss Marple set out early, her pace steady as she made her way to the Carmody estate, where Felix awaited her on the wide gravel drive. The house, with its ivy-clad walls and latticed windows, seemed more somber than usual, the weight of recent events pressing on its grand but aging shoulders. Felix greeted her with a curt nod. "The police have been through every inch of the house, but as you saw last night, no sign of forced entry to the safe itself. Whoever tried to open it either had the key or knowledge of its mechanisms." Miss Marple considered this, her eyes drifting to the porch where a small cluster of villagers had gathered, whispering among themselves. The tension in the air was palpable, fear and suspicion growing in equal measure. "I imagine many are watching closely," she said softly. "Fear often breeds boldness, Felix, and sometimes desperation." Felix sighed. "Yes. Even old friends are looking at each other sideways now. I'm beginning to wonder if we're uncovering secrets better left alone." "That is seldom the case," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside. "Truth has a way of freeing us, no matter how tangled the roots of the past." Inside, the house retained its faded elegance. the polished wood gleaming despite the dust, the curtains drawn as if to shut out the uncertainties beyond. Penrose was waiting in the drawing room, a folder of documents spread before him. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, rising. "There's been an update from the police. They found something unusual during their search, an old ledger hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Isabel's study." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "A ledger? Indeed. It appears to contain detailed records, not financial, but personal. Names, dates, cryptic notes. It could be the key to understanding Isabel's hidden fears." Felix leaned forward eagerly. "May we see it?" Penrose nodded and handed over the folder. Jane perused the contents carefully. The entries were written in a careful, deliberate hand, many cross-referencing dates that matched those in the library's ledger and the annotations Miss Partridge had found. Several names recurred, some familiar, others not. One name in particular stood out: Eleanor Blunt, a woman who had lived quietly on the outskirts of the village until her sudden death several months earlier. The ledger referenced a meeting between Isabel and Eleanor just weeks before Isabel's own passing. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village gossip and the shadowed figure who seemed to loom over the past. Who was Eleanor to Isabel? And what secret did their meetings conceal? "I think we should visit the Blunt residence," Jane said, folding the papers carefully. "There might be something left behind that sheds light on their relationship." Felix agreed, and they set out shortly after, the sky now breaking into a light drizzle that glossed the winding lanes with a slick sheen. The Blunt cottage stood at the village's edge, its garden wild with overgrown ivy and untended flowers. The wooden gate creaked as they pushed it open. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Miss Marple moved through the rooms, her eyes searching for anything out of place. In the sitting room, she noticed a small writing desk, its surface cluttered with faded papers and a solitary candle stub. Among the scattered letters, she found a bundle tied with a faded blue ribbon. Carefully untying it, she discovered correspondence between Eleanor and Isabel, letters filled with coded language and veiled references to events long past. One letter, dated only weeks before Isabel's death, spoke of a burden carried too long and a warning to trust no one outside this circle. Felix's brow furrowed. "A circle?" Jane considered the phrase thoughtfully. Perhaps a group of confidants or conspirators, bound by a secret. As they left the cottage, Miss Marple's mind pieced together a delicate tapestry of old alliances, betrayals, and fears. The presence of Eleanor Blunt, the cryptic letters, the ledger entries, all pointed toward a network of hidden relationships within the village. Returning to the Carmody estate, they found the village bustling with murmurs. News had spread of the attempted break-in, and the atmosphere had grown uneasy, with eyes darting suspiciously from one face to another. That afternoon, Miss Marple called a meeting at the village hall, inviting those closest to the mystery. Felix Penrose, Kitty Benham and Madge Pierce gathered in the modest room, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper and faded portraits of Muchwood's past. Miss Marple began gently, "I believe we are dealing not just with a dispute over inheritance, but with a secret that has bound several people for many years, a secret that Isabel Carmody guarded fiercely and which now threatens to unravel the lives of us all." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The ledger and the letters suggest a connection between Isabel and Eleanor Blunt, a woman who shared her fears and perhaps her burdens. This circle they mentioned implies others may be involved. I think it is time we listen to those who might have been silent until now. Kitty Benham's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting someone here is hiding the truth?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not hiding it so much as protecting themselves or others." Fear has a way of closing lips and shrouding motives. Penrose interjected. We should examine everyone's movements on the nights leading up to Isabel's death. The library book's return, the unsigned will, the ledger, all intersect in time. Felix nodded. Agreed. And I want to know why the safe was targeted if nothing was taken. Perhaps it is the key to understanding the urgency of recent events, Jane said, or an attempt to intimidate. As the group deliberated, Miss Marple reflected on the faces around her, each marked by their own anxieties and guarded secrets. There was truth somewhere in this room, but also layers of fear and protectiveness. Later that evening, back at her cottage, Jane sat by the fire with the letters spread before her. Her mind sifted through the delicate phrases, the hidden meanings, encoded in careful words. The burden Isabel spoke of might be the very reason for her death. A sudden knock at the door startled her. Opening it, she found Felix standing in the rain, soaked and breathless. "Miss Marple," he said urgently, "there's been a development. The police found another note. This one slipped under my door. It's a warning." He handed her a piece of paper, the handwriting jagged and unfamiliar. "Stop digging. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, or the grave will not hold them." Jane's eyes narrowed. The stakes were higher now, the shadow longer. The past was no longer content to whisper. It was roaring, demanding justice or revenge. As the night deepened over Muchwood-on-Lee, Miss Marple felt the familiar chill of a mystery drawing ever tighter, the pieces poised to fall into place or to shatter the fragile peace forever. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the worn carpet as Jane settled into her favorite armchair. The threatening note Felix had brought weighed heavily on her mind. The stark warning, a grim reminder that the shadows enveloping Muchwood-on-Lee were growing darker by the hour. Yet, Miss Marple's calm exterior betrayed none of the storm within. She was accustomed to the quiet menace of secrets long buried, and the desperate measures taken to keep them hidden. Felix arrived promptly, his expression still tight from the previous night's tension. "I've informed the local constable about the note, but I suspect whoever sent it is watching closely," he said, lowering himself into a chair opposite Jane. "It's becoming clear that this is no ordinary inheritance dispute." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "No, Felix. The threats, the break-in attempt, the ledger, it all points to someone desperate to control the narrative, to keep a history hidden from view." They began to piece together a timeline, linking the appearance of the returned library, book to the appearance of the photograph, the unsigned will, and now the threatening messages. The threads led inevitably to a circle of people intertwined by shared histories and guarded secrets. "Have you spoken to Kitty Benham again?" Jane inquired. She seemed troubled, and her mention of a shadowed figure might be more than just a village ghost story. Felix hesitated. "I visited her yesterday. She's frightened but reluctant to speak openly. She hinted that some truths in Muchwood are dangerous, more dangerous than she imagined." Jane's mind worked quietly, recalling Kitty's wary glances and sudden silences. If the past was indeed haunting the present, then Kitty's silence could be a key, either as protector or unwilling accomplice. Determined to move forward, Miss Marple suggested they pay a visit to the vicar, Reverend Tilling, a man known for his gentle demeanour and deep knowledge of the village's history. The Reverend's small rectory was tucked away behind the parish church, its garden blooming with early summer flowers despite the prevailing gloom. Reverend Tilling greeted them warmly, his eyes reflecting concern beneath the heavy brows. "I've heard of the troubles at the Carmody estate," he said. "Isabel was a complex soul, beloved by some, feared by others." Jane carefully broached the subject of Eleanor Blunt and the mysterious circle referenced in the letters. The vicar sighed deeply. "Eleanor was part of a group, a kind of informal fellowship who sought to preserve the reputation of certain families, including the Carmodys. They shared confidences, yes, but also secrets that could ruin lives if exposed. Felix's brow furrowed. Did this group have a name? Not a formal one, the Reverend replied, but some called them the Keepers. Their purpose was to protect the village's social fabric, often at great personal cost. Miss Marple exchanged a look with Felix. The pieces began to fit together. The burden Isabel spoke of, the letter's warning of trust and betrayal, the ledger's cryptic entries, all suggested the Keepers were still very much a presence, even if hidden behind polite smiles. As they left the rectory, a soft drizzle had begun, dampening the cobblestones and blurring the edges of the village. The storm gathering overhead mirrored the turmoil beneath the surface. Later that day, Miss Marple requested a meeting with Kitty Benham, hoping to draw out the truths the young woman guarded so fiercely. At Kitty's quaint cottage, the air was thick with unspoken fears. Kitty's hands trembled as she served tea, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. "Miss Marple," she began, voice barely above a whisper, "there are things about the Keepers you should know. They were more than just protectors. Sometimes their loyalty demanded terrible sacrifices. Isabel tried to break free from their hold, but some debts cannot be undone." Jane listened intently as Kitty revealed that Isabel had confided in her about threats made by members of the group, veiled warnings to remain silent or face ruin. The photograph and the returned book, Kitty suggested, were symbols, a language, of reminders that the past was watching. And the shadowed figure? Miss Marple asked softly. Kitty hesitated. Some say he was Eleanor's husband. Others believe he was the true puppet master behind the Keepers. No one has seen him openly in years, but his influence lingers. This revelation added a new dimension to the mystery, hinting at a hidden power manipulating events from the shadows. Meanwhile, the police report confirmed that the threatening note was penned by someone with a shaky hand, likely desperate or fearful. The handwriting matched none of the immediate suspects, deepening the enigma. Returning home, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the ledger once more. She had noticed a peculiar entry that day, an overlooked line mentioning a secret meeting on the night before Isabel's death, scheduled at the very chapel ruins where the locket was found. The question now was who attended that meeting, and what was said that sealed Isabel's fate. The next morning, Jane arranged to meet Madge Pierce at the village school, hoping the schoolteacher's connections might shed light on those who had been in the chapel that night. Madge was hesitant at first, but eventually recalled seeing several villagers take the narrow footpath toward the ruins after dusk, their faces tense and voices low. Among them were Charles Bicknell and Penrose, Madge said quietly. But also a man I didn't recognize, a stranger to Muchwood. Felix's eyes darkened. Could this be the shadowed figure? Miss Marple's heart quickened. If the shadowed figure was indeed present that night, then the past and present were converging dangerously close. Together, they resolved to investigate the chapel ruins more thoroughly, seeking any physical evidence or witnesses that might reveal what transpired during that fateful meeting. As twilight descended, Miss Marple and Felix approached the chapel with lanterns in hand. The ruins stood silent, moss-covered stones whispering of long-forgotten prayers and secrets. In the fading light, Jane's keen eyes caught a faint indentation on the ground, a shallow depression near the altar, as if something had been hastily buried or concealed. Carefully, they began to excavate, uncovering a small, weathered box. Inside lay several letters, sealed but brittle with age. Among them was a note, penned in a familiar hand, Isabel's handwriting, pleading for forgiveness and revealing the terrible truth she had tried to hide. The note spoke of betrayal within the Keepers, of a plan to seize control of the Carmody estate through deceit and fear, and of a promise made to protect those she loved, even at the cost of her own life. As Jane read aloud, the final pieces began to fall into place. The motives, the alliances, the fragile balance between loyalty and treachery. In the quiet of the chapel ruins, Miss Marple felt the weight of history settle around her. The shadows that had haunted Muchwood-on-Lee were no longer intangible whispers, but revealed as a human tragedy, entwined with the very fabric of the village. Tomorrow, the truth would need to be spoken aloud, but tonight, the past lay exposed, vulnerable, undeniable, and waiting for justice. Miss Marple stood quietly in the village hall, now crowded with the key figures of Muchwood-on-Lee, the anxious, the curious, and the guilty alike. The tension was palpable. The murmur of whispers had given way to expectant silence as all awaited her words. The threads of the mystery had been woven tightly, and now they were to be unraveled, stitch by stitch. She began, her voice calm but clear. The events that have brought us here are not merely about an inheritance or a broken will. They reach back to old promises, betrayals, and a secret society, the Keepers, who believed they were guardians of this village's reputation, yet in doing so became its prison wardens. Her gaze swept the room. Isabel Carmody, far from the serene lady many thought her to be, was burdened by these secrets. The ledger and letters found hidden reveal her attempts to expose the truth, and her fears that some would do anything to prevent that. Turning to Felix, she continued, "The unsigned will was a ruse, a last attempt to protect those she cared for. The returned library book and the photograph were not simply nostalgic relics, but warnings, tokens used by the Keepers to remind Isabel to stay silent." Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on Penrose and Charles Bicknell, their faces pale, tension coiled in their postures. The night before Isabel's death, several members of the Keepers met at the chapel ruins. Among them was Eleanor Blunt's husband, the so-called shadowed figure, whose influence extended beyond the grave. It was he who orchestrated the threats and the break-in, hoping to retrieve evidence Isabel had hidden, the letters that would have unraveled them all. A faint gasp rippled through the crowd. "Isabel's death was not an accident or a simple misfortune," Jane said gently. "She was silenced to protect the Keeper's power, to preserve a fragile facade." Felix swallowed hard, then nodded. Penrose and Charles were complicit, not willing killers perhaps, but enablers of the deception, bound by fear and loyalty. Miss Marple turned last to Kitty Benham, her voice softer still. "You, Kitty, held the courage to speak, to reveal what others would not. Your fears were justified, but your honesty has helped bring light to this darkness." The room held its breath. "Justice," Miss Marple concluded, "is not only about punishment, but about uncovering truth and setting it free." As the constables moved to make their arrests, a quiet calm settled over the village. The tangled web of secrets had been cut, the long-buried betrayals laid bare. Yet beneath the relief was a lingering unease, a reminder that human nature, with all its flaws and complexities, is never easily understood or wholly tamed. Miss Marple, standing just outside the hall as dusk deepened, allowed herself a small, reflective smile. Muchwood-on-Lee would heal slowly and perhaps become a little wiser. As for her, she would return to her garden, where the simplest observations of people, places, and little moments would always guide her hand in untangling the next knot. The quiet village had spoken at last, and in its voice lay the enduring truth. Beneath the most peaceful surfaces, human hearts harbor stories waiting to be told.